Okay, as people are joining, we're just waiting for everybody to get into this webinar. We'll be starting in a few moments' time. Welcome everybody. As you're joining, I can just see the webinar is filling up with participants. We'll be beginning shortly once everybody has arrived. Just giving people a few moments more to arrive in the webinar before we begin.
We've just had a question already asking if the PowerPoint will be accessible after the webinar. This will be going on the Plantlife YouTube page, so you'll be able to see it on there afterwards, as are all of the webinars from this Fall into Nature series. Okay, I think we're going to make a start. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. Just like that. The webinar this morning is on rainforest plants, an introduction to lichens, bryophytes, and ferns. And this is going to be delivered by myself, Kate Hind, and my colleague, Alison Smith. We are based in the southwest of the UK, and we work on a project all to do with rainforests. This webinar is part of the Plantlife Fall into Nature with Plantlife series, which is an autumn series full of workshops and webinars. And you can find out about all of these on our Plantlife website. And the ones that have already happened are already up on our YouTube page, our Plantlife YouTube page, which the details of are going in the chat, so you can see those as well. As the webinar continues, myself and Alison won't be able to see the chat, but we do have a colleague on there who'll be able to answer some questions. But if you have any specific questions about lichens, bryophytes, or ferns, please can you hold on to them and put them in the Q&A, and then we have time at the end to go through those questions with you as well. So let's get started. Move on. To start, I've put this fantastic slide together with some beautiful pictures. And on the left is a stunning bryophyte. In the middle is this really vibrant fern. And on the right is this intricate lichen. And these are some of the species that we're going to be talking about today and where they grow in the UK. So during this session, we're going to talk about what temperate rainforest is and where you can find it. And then we're going to delve into ferns, bryophytes, and lichens. And we're going to give a really brief introduction on all of them. If you get really enthused by our session today, we do have some extra resources to help you learn more about them. So for the ferns on our YouTube page, there's a fantastic half-an-hour YouTube video to help you identify ferns. And then later in the new year, we'll be doing the same for bryophytes and lichens. And we're also going to have some self-led online learning courses for you. But back to today, we're going to look at the ferns and give you 4 key skills to help you identify them when you're in the woods. And then we're going to tell you about a couple of our favourite species. Then we're going to talk about the bryophytes and a little bit about how they help manage water in the woods. And then again, I'm going to show you some of my favourite species. And then finally, the lichens, some of their hidden potential. And Alison is going to show you some of her favourite species as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we haven't done this before, but we want to do something interactive with you. So if it doesn't quite work, we'll just move on. But what we've got is an interactive Wordle. So if you have a smartphone with you or are able to open this on your computer, if you could put in slido.com into your browser, or there is a QR code, and then if you go in through slido.com, you will have to put this number 563547, and that will bring you into our live Wordle. And what we're asking you is to, in your mind, picture a rainforest, and what 3 words best describe this image. So if you think of a rainforest, what are the 3 words that best describe it? And then live, your words will populate the screen, and the words that people type the most will come up bigger. So as you can see, it's already happening. We're getting lush, humid, green, wet, vibrant. Oh, someone's put tapirs. I think that's like the Amazon rainforest. Gloomy, shade, ferny, steamy. Yes, it can be really moist and warm. Enchanting, that's a lovely word. Luscious toucans, that's what I would think of as well. Oh, I'm really chuffed this works. That's fantastic. So as you can see, everybody's adding things, but the words that are coming up most are green, lush, biodiverse. They're very diverse. Humid, noisy. I can imagine a tropical rainforest could be very noisy. Oh, this is brilliant. Look at this going. Someone's put invertebrates, undergrowth. A mosaic. I think that's really important when you think of a rainforest. It has a lot of, it's not homogeneous. There's lots of different things going on and lots of different microhabitats within the rainforest. Great. Okay, thank you so much for contributing to this. And the kind of words that I want us to think about is that it is lush, green, humid, wet, biodiverse, and damp. And that are the words that maybe you think of for a tropical rainforest, but we're talking about a temperate rainforest. And those same words describe a temperate rainforest as well. And the temperate rainforest in the planet, only 1% of the planet has the right climatic conditions for this temperate rainforest. And the UK is one of those places. So I want you to think about those words and how they describe temperate rainforest as well. And I'm now going to show you a fantastic video. Move the slide on. So Plantlife made this brilliant video earlier in the year, and it was filmed in the Lake District. I have a feeling that I might need to just reshare my slides because I don't think I added the sound on, so just bear with me. One of those things, oh no, I had, but you always have to remember to check. So we made this film early in the year, and it was filmed in the Lake District. And I want to show it today to really give you that feeling of what a temperate rainforest is. I'm just going to press play.
And into the forest I go, to lose my mind and find my soul.
The beauty of these magical woodlands has inspired poets.
Beneath the roof of sleeping leaves, the dreams of trees unfold.
But what do these woodlands in the Lake District have in common with woodlands in northern Iran or southern Japan? They're part of the world's great temperate rainforest and home to exceptional and exceptionally rare plants. Temperate rainforests are found in cooler climates than their more famous tropical counterparts. From the Pacific Northwest to southeastern Australia and northwest Europe, these places are some of the last remaining strongholds on the planet. Here on the western coasts of Britain and Ireland, from Scotland through to southern England, these ancient and globally scarce rainforests are making their last stand. The wet and mild climate, influenced by the Gulf Stream, creates the perfect environment for plants that are found nowhere else in the world. Our temperate rainforests are one of the oldest living ecosystems, and this long history, plus a good dosing of rain, results in these spectacular habitats. But what truly defines them are these amazing little life forms: lichens, mosses and liverworts. And it's these organisms that make these places so special and of international importance. When you walk into these woodlands, the first thing you notice is that every available surface is cloaked in life. The trees are covered from head to toe in lichens. And the boulders are carpeted in mosses. But when you take a closer look, you zoom in on another world that's so easy to overlook. With their beautiful, intricate detailing, lichens and mosses create miniature forests within forests. Rain that isn't absorbed by the lichens and mosses cuts its way through the landscape as waterfalls, ravines, rivers and streams. The closed tree canopy locks in moisture, creating the humid microclimate that is the essence of a rainforest, where life can thrive. Within the tapestry of this landscape, pasture woodlands with their ancient veteran trees are particularly important for lichens. Generations of farmers have grazed their animals in these woodlands, their careful management creating open spaces to allow sunlight to flood in, which is essential for a rich lichen flora. But Britain's temperate rainforests are under threat. Habitat loss, pollution, climate change and invasive species are all taking their toll. Tree diseases such as ash dieback can also ravage a landscape like this, and ash trees are often home to some of the richest communities of lichens, mosses and liverworts. So when a tree dies and falls down, the suite of life that it supports goes down with it. Plantlife is working hard to protect these extraordinary woodlands and the life they support. If you'd like to help us, you can donate.
With opportunity, the world is very interesting.
Whenever our team, Alison, myself, or Rachel Jones, who's another team member, whenever we see this video, it makes us feel so proud. And it's such a showcase of the things that we work on. So it's a really fantastic video. And if you would like to watch the video again, it is on our Plantlife YouTube page. But hopefully that has shown some of the things that we were talking about. And I'm just going to go over those again of what makes a temperate rainforest. So we have this lovely infographic that's on the screen now, and it has some of the top things that we look for to create a temperate rainforest. So the first thing at the top left is that we need a lot of rainfall. So we find the temperate rainforests in the UK where there is high rainfall. And this means that there's damp conditions, hopefully all year round, and high humidity. The humidity is really important under the canopy. We also need light that reaches the forest floor to help the plants and the lichens grow. So we need a really healthy rainforest that has gaps in the canopy where light can come down to the forest floor. And sometimes you go into woods where it's a really dense plantation and there's no light at all, and you kind of walk in and it's incredibly dark. And on the forest floor, there won't be any plants growing at all because the light just can't penetrate through. We need clean and warm air, and this is brought in by the Gulf Stream. And again, this kind of helps maybe in your mind work out where the temperate rainforest is in the UK. We find a huge growth of lush mosses, liverworts, lichens and ferns. We do have some really rare species that grow here, and they grow not just on the trees, but on the branches, boulders, and sometimes they completely carpet the whole of the forest floor. Generally, we will have streams and rivers, ravines, boggy areas, a whole kind of matrix of wet areas through the woodland, through the rainforest. In the understory, we'll have different tree species that never make it up to the canopy. So we might get some beautiful holly, hawthorn, alder, rowan, the rowan particularly up in Scotland, and they never will make it up to the canopy. They're smaller tree species, but they add to the diversity of things growing in the woodland. And then we have native deciduous trees as well, and they will be of a mix of ages, which is really important. So we have oaks and ashes, and we'll have saplings all the way up to veteran trees, which are big, large trees over 400 years old. And that mix of the canopy trees and under canopy trees, you think of the different ages and the different tree species, that provides different pHs on the bark and different types of bark. So you get lovely smooth trees, and some of the really old ones will be really fissured and cracked. And you get lots of different lichens in particular that will grow in there. And then these woodlands take 400 years or so to get the correct conditions in the woodland so that you get a diverse range of plants and animals growing there. So it's a real mix of different things that you're expecting to find in these temperate rainforests, and that allows there to be a real diversity of species growing there. So on this map, we've shaded in where temperate rainforest is in the UK. So right at the top, Westland, Scotland. I was there a few weeks ago, and as you're driving through the temperate rainforest, you can even spot some of the special species, the fantastic lichens, just driving through them. It was incredible. And then we have them in the Lake District, in Wales. Again, a lovely wet environment with lots of lovely temperate rainforest there. And then again, down where Alison and I are based. So North Somerset, the Quantocks, in Devon, on Dartmoor and Exmoor, and then into some parts of Cornwall as well. So as I have already said, temperate rainforest is globally rare, and they demonstrated that in the video. So there's only a few places around the globe that you can find it. In the UK, it's along the west coastline, closer to the Gulf Stream. But there is a difference in the UK between the temperate rainforests. So here in the southwest, we are a bit drier and a bit warmer. So we have slightly different species than you'd expect to find right at the top in Western Scotland. And we get asked quite a lot, what is it about the habitat that makes these plants and lichens thrive? And the two kind of main things are the humidity under the canopy. It's really moist. And you notice that when you walk into them, it feels moist and damp in there. And that there's a low temperature range. So throughout the year, there isn't a huge variability in temperature. You rarely get frosts. So it kind of stays a relative temperature and it's very moist. And it means some really interesting species can grow. The picture on the right is a filmy fern, and that's my finger behind it, just to demonstrate how delicate and fine this fern is. We only have 2 species of filmy fern in the UK, and they grow in the temperate rainforest. And the other filmy fern species you find in tropical rainforests. So it really shows that the conditions of this really moist area is very important, and you get these lovely species growing. And this filmy fern was right by a river, completely protected, hiding under some boulders, and it also had some other really rare mosses and liverworts growing with it. But it is absolutely beautiful. So we're now going to move on to ferns. And Alison's just going to take control.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So I'm just going to take over Kate's presentation now, so that I can talk to you, first of all, for the next sort of 20-25 minutes about the fantastic world of ferns. And when we think of temperate rainforest, we often think of fern-filled landscapes, as these images show here. And the humid conditions, these really damp conditions that Kate's been describing, create the perfect environment for ferns to thrive. So we find ferns growing on the forest floor, but we also find ferns growing in many different places in temperate rainforests. So they will grow on boulders, they will grow on tree trunks, they will grow on tree branches as epiphytes. And that's all related to the amount of moisture that we find in these environments. And the mosses actually are really important here, because they will often cover the boulders, cover the trees, and they retain a lot of moisture and provide an environment for the ferns to grow, not just on the ground, but on all sorts of different surfaces within the rainforest. And ferns are really fascinating in terms of how much they vary. So within our temperate rainforests, we find ferns that are over 2 meters in height, such as the wonderful royal fern, which I'll talk to you a bit more about shortly, right down to really tiny ferns like the filmy ferns that Kate was just describing, which can only be, in some cases, 2 centimeters in length, really delicate, temperate rainforest specialists. So quite a variation in size. We only actually have about 60 species of fern in Britain, and not all of those are found in the temperate rainforest. So in terms of the number of species, when we compare that to flowering plants or indeed bryophytes or lichens, we're dealing with quite a small number of species. So they can seem like they might be a more manageable group to get to grips with, but ferns are often considered challenging in terms of learning to identify them. So I'm hoping that in the next 20-25 minutes I can demystify them a little bit for you and help you to start to recognise differences between species when you're out and about, maybe to identify some of them, and certainly to appreciate the diversity a little bit more. Okay. So to begin with, a slightly unusual slide, but what connects this custard cream biscuit with the fern on the right here? So you probably have never looked at this closely at a custard cream biscuit before. I certainly hadn't until recently, but the pattern on the custard cream is actually inspired by the unfurling croziers of fern fronds, as you can see in this image here. So you can kind of see that there. You've got these sort of curling fronds, which is when the ferns first start to unfurl in the spring. They have this crozier, which sort of slowly straightens and opens out, and that's made its way into the custard cream biscuit. The purpose of this slide is to show you that ferns have permeated our culture. And when you sort of look, you start to see how they've inspired many different things. They've really piqued our interest over centuries. We can go back into literature and Shakespeare, and there's lots of references to ferns. And the Victorians in particular were obsessed with ferns. And the author Charles Kingsley coined the phrase pteridomania, So pteridomania is a word for this fascination with ferns. It comes from the word pteridophytes, which is the scientific name for ferns and their allies, which are the group of vascular spore-producing plants. And unfortunately, this pteridomania, this fascination with ferns during the Victorian era, led to many people unscrupulously collecting ferns from the wild. So it led to the decline in many species. But certainly what this slide shows is just how ferns have really interested people for many years. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why I think, anyway, ferns are such fascinating plants. So what are ferns? Well, ferns are ancient, first of all. They have been on the planet for a very long time. They first appear in the fossil record around 350 to 400 million years ago. And they are relatively unchanged from that time as well. So when we look at fern fossils, and you can see an image here, we can very much identify that as a fern. It looks quite similar to ferns that we find today. And there are indeed species that existed during the Jurassic period, for example, that we still have today. So the royal fern that I mentioned, this very large fern, grows over 2 meters in height. We still find in our temperate rainforest and other parts of the UK as well. It was around during the Jurassic period, and it was very similar to how it is now. It hasn't evolved a great deal since then. And one of the reasons for that and the slow evolution in ferns is all to do with how they reproduce. So I mentioned that ferns are spore-producing plants, and you can see the image here is showing you some of the spore cases that you often find on the underside of fern fronds. So do make sure, if you haven't looked before, next time you're out walking in the woods, this time of year, you can still see these on many of the fronds. Have a look on the underside, because these are really fascinating structures. So ferns reproduce by means of spore production. And I've got a little diagram here. I don't want to get too technical, but this is just showing the fern life cycle. And they have a really fascinating life cycle, because it's sort of a 2-part life cycle. And they begin as a tiny little green prothallus, a little structure that you probably haven't seen before, very, very tiny, so you don't generally notice it out in the wild. And it's called a prothallus. And on this tiny little green structure is where you find the sperm cells and the egg cells. And what needs to happen in order for fertilization to occur, so that we actually get the plant that we recognize as a fern growing, is water needs to run across the surface of the prothallus, pick up some of the sperm cells, and then run across and deposit it on the egg cells, and then fertilization occurs. So in most cases, or in many cases, we're talking about self-fertilization. So you're not getting a lot of genetic mixing, which is one of the reasons ferns evolve very, very slowly and remain very much very little changed from when they first appeared. We have this very sort of slow process of evolution due to that self-fertilization. Once that fertilization has occurred, as I say, we then get the plant growing as we know it, the fern with its fronds, and then the spores are produced usually on the underside of those fronds. And we're going to look a little bit more shortly at what those structures look like and how they work. So ferns are ancient, they're spore-producing plants. It's a very primitive form of reproduction that came long before flowering plants evolved. But they are vascular plants, and they were among the first vascular plants to evolve. And what this means is a bit like how we have veins and arteries, our vascular system. They are plants that have a vascular system. They have xylem and phloem vessels, which help to transport water and nutrient around the plant. And they have roots which draw water and nutrients up from the soil. As I say, they were among the first plants to develop these tissues and this vascular system. And what that meant was previously when you had bryophytes, the mosses and liverworts, which Kate's going to talk to you about shortly. They didn't have this well-developed vascular system for transporting water and nutrients. That really restricts their size to being very, very small, because water and nutrients can only move very slowly cell to cell. And the development of a vascular system meant ferns could grow much larger. So we have these larger plants which are pumping out lots of oxygen. They actually help to pave the way for the evolution of terrestrial life. So very, very significant in evolutionary terms. Also having roots meant that they could grow further away from wet environments and move further onto dry land. They're really crucial in terms of plant evolution. So for me, that's why ferns are so fascinating. Many people find them fascinating for different reasons. They're incredibly beautiful, often look quite delicate, they're quite symmetrical. So they've inspired all sorts of people, all sorts of artists as well. So what I want to look at next, we've looked a little bit about at what ferns are. Want to look now at how you might start to identify them, because as I said, they're often perceived as being quite a challenging group of plants, even though we have relatively few species in the UK. But it's all really about knowing a few tricks and things that you need to look for. So there are 4 key skills we think that you need to identify ferns, and they're really 4 key things to look for when you first approach a fern that you're not familiar with, that will help you to classify it. Okay, so the very first thing to look at is the growth form, the way the fern is growing. And there are 3 types of growth form in ferns. So we have I'm going to go into a bit more detail in those in a minute. Those are just some icons showing the different growth forms. I'm going to describe each of those in a moment. The second skill I'm going to talk to you about is frond shape. So the shape of the above ground portion of the fern. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the third skill, which is counting frond divisions. So some ferns have entire fronds, which aren't divided, but many of them are divided into separate segments. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then the fourth skill we're going to look at is actually some of the other features. So it's kind of multiple skills really, because we're looking at a few other ID features that are important when you're looking at ferns. So the very first of these then, identifying growth forms. We have many ferns, particularly some of the larger woodland species, grow in what we call a shuttlecock type growth form, where you have a vertical rhizome going down into the ground, and then all of the fronds, and the frond is the name for the whole above ground portion of the plant. So that includes the stem and then the leaf blade. All of the fronds emerge from one point in the ground, and then they're coming out at a sort of 45-degree-ish angle. They're not very lax, they're quite upright. So they almost look like a shuttlecock that had the rubber bit stuck in the ground, and then the rest is sort of coming out like this. And so that's a shuttlecock-like growth form. Most of our large woodland ferns grow in this way. We then have the open rosette. So this is similar, again, there's a vertical rhizome, and all of the fronds appear to arise from the same point in the ground or the substrate, but this time it's more lax, so they're not particularly upright. The fronds actually lie back, often touching the ground in an open rosette. And then quite different, we have ferns that grow, there's an example of an open rosette there. We have ferns that grow on a creeping rhizome. Bracken's a classic example of this. So you actually have a creeping rhizome under the ground, and then the fronds appear to arise separately from the ground, but they are actually connected on this underground rhizome. So that's why bracken is very difficult to get rid of, because you're often dealing with actually a very large area of creeping rhizome underground with all the fronds connected to do that. Creeping rhizome is another example here. I'm going to talk a bit more about this one. This is the polypody fern, which is very prevalent in the temperate rainforest, growing on branches of trees like this. And actually this may all be one plant connected on a big creeping rhizome growing underneath that moss. So identifying growth forms is a really useful thing if you want to identify ferns. Next, assessing frond shape. So the fern fronds are different shapes. Some of them are very, very narrow. Some of them are more broad. Some of them are actually triangular. And it's all about really looking to see if the fern is narrow at the base and then broadening out and tapering again at the tip, as in the two images on the left, sort of the narrow frond shapes, or are they broad at the base, broad in the middle and then tapering, such as the middle image there, which is a broad frond shape, or are they more triangular, where they're broadest at the base and then taper from there towards the tip. And this is actually quite a useful feature for separating similar looking species. And the far right image there is showing a frond which is actually made up of multiple triangular segments. And this is where you have something like bracken, where the segments coming off actually have their own long stem. So it actually gives the appearance of a frond that's made up of multiple triangular segments. The third skill is all to do with counting frond divisions. And this is probably one of the most important skills and one of the most useful when it comes to identifying ferns. So, as I say, some of the fronds are undivided and look very solid, and they don't have any divisions in the leaf, whereas others have different degrees of divisions, and the more divided they are, the more sort of feathery their appearance. So I'm just going to show you a short video here, which will, in the woods, talk you through a number of different species and count those divisions so you can learn that skill.
Here we have a fern whose fronds are undivided. So you can see these rather mossy, shiny, thick fern fronds aren't broken up into any smaller segments at all. This one's got a kind of wavy edge, and it is in fact an evergreen fern. It's got a kind of waxy, leathery feel to it, but it's a solid fern and it's undivided. This little rather yellow frond is an example of a frond that is divided once, or pinnate. So if we count the stem as 0, we count out from the stem just once. These are the pinna, and they're not further divided up. These little sections are solid. So this fern is just divided once. So 0, 1, which makes it pinnate. So we've got this beautiful big fern here. Let's see how many times divided these fronds are. So let's take a closer look. So if we count this central stem here as 0, it's divided up once into these segments which we call pinna, and then twice into these smaller segments called pinnules. And if we take a really close look here, you can see that they aren't divided any further. So this fern is divided twice, or bipinnate. So we've got 0, divided once, divided twice. Let's take a closer look at this fern and see if we can work out how many times this frond is divided. If we start with this central stem as 0, it's divided once into these pinna, twice into these pinnules, and then if we look at these pinnules, we can see that they are divided up again into a smaller segment that we call a pinnulette. And these little pinnulettes are actually quite finely toothed, and you might almost think that it was divided up 4 times, but this is a tripinnate fern with a frond divided up 3 times. So we've got 0, 1, 2, and then these are broken up further, so it's divided 3 times.
So that video just gives you a little bit of an insight into how you count those frond divisions, and it might be something you want to go and watch again on our YouTube channel. It's quite useful if you're new to that to watch it several times, and actually to get some fern fronds and have a practice. because pretty much every fern identification guide will divide ferns into those categories of undivided pinnate, divided once, bipinnate, divided twice, and tripinnate, divided 3 times. So getting to grips with that is really important for being able to identify the ferns. Okay. The other identification features which are useful for you to know and to look for, I'm just going to cover here. So we have the spore cases. So I mentioned that ferns are spore producing plants, and actually the structures that produce those spores are really useful in identification, and in many species those are on the underside of the frond. They look very different in different species. So in some species, such as this here, this is the hart's tongue fern. This is a species that you will find across the UK. It grows in all sorts of conditions. It generally prefers conditions where there is some lime, but will grow in more acidic conditions. It tends to be a bit more stunted. And it's this lovely, glossy, undivided frond, the hart's tongue fern. And one of the features is the spore cases on the back are linear. So they're really, really distinctive and quite different to a lot of the other species. And the Latin name for this fern, the hart's tongue fern, is Asplenium scolopendrium. Scolopendrium comes from the Latin for centipede, and that's to do with the appearance of these spore cases. They're known as sori. It's another name for the spore cases on the back. And they're linear, like the legs of a centipede, and then you've got the midrib running up the centre of the frond there, looking like the body. So that's actually given the species its Latin name. In many other species, those spore cases look quite different. So this is a shield fern here with a very lovely shuttlecock-like growth form. It's actually got the hart's tongue fern growing in the same place as it. So you've actually got 2 shuttlecock growth form ferns growing together. The underside of this species, we can see the sori on the back here, all the spore cases, and they're actually grouped in lots of sort of little circles on the underside of the frond. And this image is showing you lots of different things, actually. You've got the sort of grey, the large grey patches, circular patches, is where there's a membrane covering the spore cases. So early in their development, there's a protective membrane known as the inducia, and that covers the spore cases and protects the developing spores. And as the spores mature, that inducia sheds, and in this species it shrivels. So where you can see the sort of orangey brown sort of circular coverings on the spore cases, that's the shriveled inducium, and often it sort of shrivels into the middle, leaving just a very small patch, and underneath you can see these black caviar-like spore cases, and within those spores are maturing and getting ready to disperse. So the actual shape of these spore cases is really helpful in identification, as well as their arrangement and their position on the frond. Another useful identification feature is to actually look at those ferns that are divided into smaller segments. This is a bipinnate fern, and those small segments on the leaf there, those are known as pinnules. And on this species, they are shaped like mittens. You can sort of make out there's a thumb segment and then the finger segments. It's a mitten shape, and they have little spines on the tips of the finger segment and on the tip of the thumb segment as well. So there are other little features like that that can be really helpful. And then finally, another important identification feature for ferns is scales. There are often scales on the stem and on the backs of the fronds on some species as well. So here you can see some stem scales. These can help to protect the fern, particularly as it's developing in its early stages. And this is a species called broad buckler fern, which is a very common fern across the UK. And the scales have a stripe on them, which you can sort of make out here. It's pale around the edges and then has a dark vertical stripe. And that feature helps to separate it from 2 very similar species. Scales can also be found on the backs of the fronds. This is the rusty back fern, which is a really distinctive one. It's got this beautiful frond that's just divided once. It's a pinnate frond, and it almost looks like it's a zigzag shape to it. You can sort of see there. And the name rusty back comes from the fact that the back of the frond is clothed in these dense, rusty coloured scales, and those scales are actually another protective layer protecting the spore cases on the back. Okay, so those are some of the features to look out for. And before I finish and hand over to Kate, who's going to take you on a bit of a tour of bryophytes, I just want to cover a couple of fern species that you can look out for when you're next out for a walk in the woods. And the first of those is actually a group of species, are the polypody ferns. The polypody fern is one that grows on a creeping rhizome, and it's very, very common in the temperate rainforest. It really thrives on the humid conditions, but you can find it outside of temperate rainforest as well. There are 3 polypody fern species that can be quite tricky to separate, and they hybridize, so there are lots of sort of subspecies as well. But they grow on this creeping rhizome, and they're often growing as an epiphyte on rocks, on boulders, on walls, and also on trees. And the rhizome will often be growing under the moss, and the moss will be creating a nice moisture and a bit of a soil layer for it to grow there. They have a broad frond shape, so you can sort of see that the frond is quite broad at the base and in the middle, and then tapers towards the tip. And it's pinnate, it's divided just once. So you have the main stem running up, and then one set of divisions coming off of that. It's known as a pinnate fern. And you can see here up in the canopy, lots of it growing on this tree. And the underside, it has these beautiful, quite rounded groups of spore cases, on the back of that frond, and they can be yellow or they can be bright orange, and they tend to be very bright coloured. So it's a really nice one to look out for. And the word polypody means many-footed, and it comes from the fact that it's growing on this creeping rhizome. So it's like feet, many feet creeping along the branches and the places where it's growing. So that's a good one to look out for and try and spot. Remember to look up into the canopy to see it. And then another one I'm going to show you here is the scaly male fern. Now this is one that you tend to find more in the west, in upland areas and in acidic areas. In more lowland areas and less acidic places, you're more likely to see the common male fern, which is closely related. And this is a fern that grows in a shuttlecock, and it has a more of a narrow frond shape, and it's bipinnate, divided twice. As you can see, the shuttlecock-like growth form there. And one of the really distinctive things about this one, as you can probably tell from the name scaly male fern, is it's covered in very, very dense scales that run all the way up the stem, and it gives it this sort of golden colour, which you can see particularly on the young fronds when they're unfurling, and you can really see the stem there covered in these golden scales. They've actually recently separated it out into a number of different species. One of them is called the golden maley scale fern, which is pictured here because it's got these really beautiful goldy bronze scales that grow on it. So that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of ferns. We run full-day courses on introduction to ferns, so this is really just to give you a little bit of a flavour for the fascinating world of ferns, what they are, their evolution, and a couple of species to look out for. But I would highly recommend going out and having a look for these 2 species, and you can get a copy of our Plantlife Ferns guide as well, and that will introduce you to a few more and take you through these steps again to help you learn to identify those. I'm going to hand over back to Kate now to take you through the bryophytes.
Great, thank you. Let me just start my video. Before we move on, I did see a couple of participants put their hand up and potentially some questions going into our chat. Alison and I are really keen to take all of your questions, but because it's a webinar, we would please like you to put them into the Q&A, and we will answer them all at the end. We have got time to answer your questions. So the next thing I want to show you is a short video, and for lichens and bryophytes, but also sometimes for ferns, it's really useful to have a hand lens. And we recommend a minimum magnification of 10 times. Sometimes you might want to go for a 25 times lens, but a 10 times is quite a good one as an introduction to get you going. And we just made a really short video on how to use it, because we've seen quite a few people pick them up and not be quite aware how best to use them, and then really struggle to see some of the features we're asking for because they're not getting enough light coming through the hand lens. So I've got a very short video I'm just going to show you on how to use one.
When looking at mosses, ferns and lichens, you sometimes want to look a bit closer to see the features. So we use a hand lens which helps magnify the features for you. The most important thing you need is access to lots of natural light. Now, if you're looking at something on a twig or a branch, you have the hand lens close to your eye, and then you bring your specimen forwards and backwards until it's into focus. If you're looking at something attached, like a branch or a trunk, again, you will move your head forwards and backwards, but you just need to be careful of any twigs around you so you don't poke yourself in the eye. There are two different magnifications we would recommend. So for ferns and lichens, we would recommend a 10 times magnification, but for mosses, we would recommend a 20 times magnification.
And hopefully you picked up on our little health and safety comment there as well. So be careful when you're looking at things in the field that you don't accidentally get poked by something close to your eye. But yes, you can buy hand lenses easily online. Oh, moving on. So I'm going to now talk about bryophytes. Bryophytes are quite new to me. I only started learning them a few years ago. And before I started to learn about them, I kind of just assumed, particularly moss. Moss was just moss. It was green. It covered some walls and rocks, and that was it. I didn't realise that there was such a diversity in mosses. And now I absolutely love them. I think they're fantastic species to look at. So I'm going to show you some of the different ones that you get, and hopefully you'll see there's a real variety and diversity in them that we have in the UK. So the bryophytes cover 3 different groups. They include the hornworts, the mosses, and the liverworts. And we don't have many hornwort species in the UK, so I'm going to focus just on the mosses and the liverworts. They are some of the oldest plants on the planet, a bit like the ferns, with estimations of over 400 million years old. They don't have any roots at all, which gives them a real adaptability to live in lots of different places in different conditions. Their leaves are only 1 cell thick, and they do tend to live in really moist areas, which is why they live in the temperate rainforest, because as we've already said, it's a really moist place. There are some species that have adapted to live in drier places. So you do find them on sand dunes or in deserts, and they have the ability to completely desiccate out. And then when the conditions are right again, they can start metabolizing again once they're wet enough. They have a really interesting life cycle, which I'm not going to go through today because it's quite complicated, but there are some really good videos on YouTube by the Naturalist Museum and the Linnean Society that go through fertilization. But one of the key things is that they need water to start the fertilization. And they don't have a complex water transport system. So they don't have specialized cells like vascular plants that have their xylem and phloem that transport water around. They do still have a transport system, but it's not these specialized cells that you get in vascular plants. We do get asked quite a lot, why are bryophytes important? Why do we want to protect them? Why are we studying them? So I'm going to go through a few of the reasons now. So one of them is they have substantial contribution to plant biomass. And if you look in this picture, that's really clear. Everything is covered in moss. So that all of the floor, all of the trunks, all of the branches are covered in moss. So they're a huge part of the plant biomass in this woodland here. They're a really important habitat and food source. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some of the mosses, and you can really understand that because they create this fantastic habitat for small animals and invertebrates to live in. And the picture down here is a cheeky tardigrade that lives within the mosses and feeds in there. And it's a really important species that lives there. They are involved in regulating the climate under the canopy. Because they are a bit like a sponge and they can hold lots of water, they do help keep the conditions right and lovely and humid under the canopy. They are involved in flood prevention, and you may hear of people using particularly a moss called the sphagnums involved in different kind of flood prevention schemes around the UK. And the sphagnum mosses can hold up to 20% of their, 20 times their weight in water. So that's amazing how much water they can hold. And you see that that can be really important in helping with flooding in different parts of the UK. They have an important role in ecological succession. And as I said at the beginning, I think of them originally growing on kind of walls and rocks. And that's because they can colonize these kind of bare ground and bare areas. And then it allows other things to come in and grow there afterwards as well. And a bit like the lichens, which Alison's going to talk about in a bit, they are indicators of the environment. So they can be used to indicate the health by if they're growing in certain places. You can understand what's going on in that particular habitat. I mentioned water regulation. I'm just going to say a little bit more about that. So sphagnum mosses are the moorland mosses generally, and that's what we think of. They also do grow in the woodland, and this is a picture I took of some sphagnum growing in the wood. And they do hold on to that water, and that helps keep the woodland, the temperate rainforest, moist all year round. They also maintain moisture in the soil. So they act as a bit of a barrier for water kind of transpiring out of the soil, and they keep it locked in. And as I've said before, they do play a role in humidity. So they help keep it moist under the canopy. So some of these other really important species, like the Filmy Fern I showed before, can thrive living under there. And they are involved in reducing woodland bank erosion. So I have a couple of videos here, which hopefully I can show you. These I took of them growing along a woodland bank. So let's see if they will play. So this is a liverwort, and it's completely covered a woodland bank. And as you can imagine, when it rains, the water will just go across the leaves. And so it doesn't have the opportunity to pick up loads of the soil and different minerals and wash it away. It kind of keeps it in the bank. And this example here is of mosses. So this is another bank, and it's completely covered again by a variety of different mosses. So when it rains, again, it's helping keep that woodland bank from eroding and losing soil and the nutrients. It all stays in the bank. They also, the mosses are very good at filtering out different compounds. And a study in Sweden was recently published a couple of years ago, where they've been doing lots of mining, and there was a lot of arsenic coming into the water table. But a moss was growing there within the arsenic water, and they discovered that it can take out over 80% of the arsenic in the water in an hour. And so that's got lots of different people and scientists and researchers thinking, well, how can we utilize this? And now different mosses are being used commercially to help filter out different minerals and compounds from water And instead of having to use different chemicals or having different things erode because of compounds like iron getting in there, the mosses are reducing the cost and cleaning the water. So they're fantastic. They're going to be, well, they're already being used commercially in lots of different areas, and I can see that growing in the next few years as well. And then something else I found out recently was this fantastic moss that I've got a picture of here. This is called Funaria, or bonfire moss. And I was in a site and we saw this moss on one of the courses that we were doing and discovered it's Funaria, or bonfire moss. And this is where on the site they do all of the bonfires that they have when they're managing the woodland. And lo and behold, the bonfire moss was growing there. But they found in studies in Portugal that this moss can help land recover from fire damage. So if it's growing in the woodlands mosses where there's been a fire, it reduces the loss of sediment and organic matter when it rains. So it stops a huge amount of runoff of soil and organic matter. But also the mosses are really quick to colonize the bare land. So if this is able to grow back where there's recently been a fire, it can quickly act to protect the land again from runoff. So if you have a fire in the summer, like we saw lots of fires in Greece, if they can get the mosses to grow and protect it from the winter to stop some of that runoff coming through. And if you want to learn a bit more about that, the EU have published this little article about it. It's called the Science of Environment Policy. And it's all about a study in Portugal using Funaria to reduce the runoff from after fire damage in Portugal. So these are really interesting things that I didn't know about mosses until I started to look into this and how important they can be in the environment, but also to help us with things like climate change. So I now want us to have a look at some of the moss species. But we have over 20,000 species of moss in the world and over 1,000 in the UK. So it's quite difficult to know where to start. So the first thing I'm going to do is get us to look at just some of the shapes of the mosses to help you get your eye in to see the range of diversity. So on this slide, we have 5 different shapes. The first is a bird's eye view, and it's like a star. The second one looks all the leaves are folding over, curving to one side. The third one is looks like a stalk with a blob on the top. It's called a sporophyte, and these are present not all year round, but they really do help with identification when they are present. The fourth is a divided moss. It's a bit like the ferns. This one has got 1 division, it's pinnate. And the 5th one is what we call tripinnate. It's divided 3 times, and it gives this lovely feathery appearance. So I've just shown you these shapes, and now I'm going to show you a video of some woodland mosses that resemble these shapes.
This moss is the shape of a star from above. This moss, all the leaves are lying to one side. This here is a stalk with a capsule on the end. This moss has a main stem and has branching leaves either side. And this moss is heavily branched and fluffy in appearance. Now we're going to go and look at these mosses on a wood bank. This is the moss that from above has the shape of a star. On this moss, the leaves are long and thin and tapered, and they all lay to one side, as you can see on this one here. Mosses don't reproduce by seeds, they reproduce from spores. As you can see here, there is a stalk with a capsule on the end where the spores come from. This moss has a central stem with branches either side. This moss is highly branched, giving it a fluffy, feathery appearance.
So we find that video really useful to demonstrate to people that there is a real range of diversity in mosses. It's not just something green growing on a rock. And hopefully that you can see that. We just picked 5 random shapes and we were able to find them just on that wood bank. Now I want to go a little bit further into identifying mosses so that if you go into the woods today or at the weekend, hopefully you'll be able to spot some. And I'm just going to go through some of the key things that you need to look for first. So first, I'm going to talk about mosses. And if you use any field guide, they will get you to break them down by the 3 main growth forms. So we have them here. We've got one called Acrocarpus, one called Pleurocarpus, and one called Sphagnum. Now the Sphagnum mosses, we could do a whole session on by themselves. So I'm not going to go into those today, but with the Acrocarps and the Pleurocarps, we're going to have a look at a couple of examples. So with the Acrocarpus mosses, they tend to be quite erect mosses and the leaves spiral all the way around the main stem. If they have a sporophyte, as shown in this picture, the stalk and the capsule on the end, it always comes from the top. Whereas with the Pleurocarpus mosses, if there is a sporophyte present, it doesn't come from the top, but some are on the stem. And the Pleurocarpus mosses tend to be more flattened and branched, and they also can look a lot messier as well. Now the Sphagnum mosses, just to help if you do see them, they seem to have a pom-pom on the top, and again, their sporophytes come from the top, but there's always more than one. So in this diagram, you can see there's 3. And then looking at the liverworts, they also have 2 main growth forms that you can use to help identify them. So there's the fallows and there's the leafy liverworts. So the fallows liverworts don't really have a distinct leaf. They're kind of these lovely fleshy pieces. And in this diagram, they've got some some pores on the top. Whereas the leafy liverworts again, are more flattened and they have pairs of leaves going down the stalk. So they do look very different, but the leafy liverworts can sometimes be confused with some of the Acrocarpus mosses. So I'm going to show you 2 mosses and a liverwort to look out for. And I'm going to start with this common woodland moss, which is an Acrocarpus moss. And its common name is swan's neck thyme moss or Nium hornum. So the thyme bit of the name comes from the shape of the leaf. And if you look at the photo in the middle, you can make out the leaves are the shape thyme. And the swan's neck comes from the sporophyte. So if you look at the picture on the right, if it has the sporophyte present, it's very elegant. The stalk comes up and then round and has the capsule on the end, resembling a bit like a swan. Now, the picture on the left and the picture in the middle are the same species, but this species is what we call dioecious. So it has male plants and female plants. And the one on the left is male. And I think it's lovely. It looks like a flower. Whereas the one in the middle is the female and it doesn't have what looks like flowers on it. If you look closely as well at both of the ones on the left and the middle, you can see that the leaves are translucent. They seem to kind of glow. And you can make out in this picture what looks like a midrib or a vein going up the center of the leaf. And that's something, if you have a hand lens, that's really nice to look at. So if you get your hand lens with you and get enough light coming through, you can really see that. And the terminology for that is a nerve. And when you get into identifying mosses, this thing called the nerve is an important feature to look for. The other thing to keep an eye out for is the picture in the middle is, as I said, the female, and you'll find this growing happily on lots of wood banks, but it tends to be start folding over or kind of oppressed to the wood bank. But when you do look at it, do check that all the leaves are going all the way around the edge, that it's translucent, and you can see this lovely nerve or midrib going up the center of the leaf. So as I said, this is a lovely common woodland moss, and you should be able to spot this easily. The next one I have on here is an absolute favorite of mine. It's a Acrocarpus Mosses, and I really like it because it looks really fluffy and spongy, and that if you needed to survive in the woods overnight, it'd be something lovely to lie on. It's called a Tamarisk Mosque, or Theridium tamaricinum, and like the ferns, this one is highly divided. We call it tripinnate because it divides 3 times from the main stem. An important thing to look out for on this is the colour of the main stem. It's always vibrant green, and there is a confusion species that has a red stem, and there's quite a few of the Acrocarpus Mosses have red stems, but this is always bright green. On the picture on the left, you can see some look brown, and that's because they are older bits that are not in great condition, but the main ones are bright green. So don't let that trick you, because it can sometimes. And we find Tamarisk moss growing happily in the woodland, and it grows in these lovely big clumps of swathes of moss. So it will take over a nice big section. But yes, look out for it being vibrant green and the stem being green and the leaves divided 3 times. So hopefully you'll be able to spot that. And the last one I'm going to show you is a liverwort. And this is a Thallow's liverwort. And I've chosen this one because it's really big and it's hard to confuse with anything else. It's called the Great Scented Liverwort because it has a mild smell, and it's called Coniceplum Conicum. Now, what I really like about this one is the first time I saw it, I actually thought it resembled the back of a frog because it's so glossy and green. So it's really shiny. And then it has what look like little spots on it, which you can see in the picture on the left as well. So it's a really beautiful liverwort. You'll find this growing in the woodland close to water. So it might be on the bank of a stream or a river. And this was what was in the video earlier, where it completely covered an area of a woodland bank. You also sometimes find it growing on rock faces as well, but it needs to be wet. It really likes really wet areas. But as you can see in the picture on the left, I'm holding it there, it's a very big liverwort. So hopefully you'll be able to spot this one as well. So if you want to find out more about those, as I said, we will be releasing some self-led learning in the new year to help you learn your bryophytes. But now I'm going to pass back to Alison, who's going to talk through some of the lichens with you.
Lovely, thank you, Kate. And I'm sure everybody's minds are bursting, having gone through ferns and bryophytes. Lots of information, but hopefully it's just inspiring you to maybe learn a little bit more. And as a reminder, this video presentation will be available on our YouTube channel as well, so you can rewatch it if you want to. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you finally then about lichens. And I did actually go out this morning and just collected a lichen covered twig from near where I live. I am lucky enough to live on the edge of temperate rainforest down in Cornwall. And today the sun is shining, but quite often we don't have such lovely weather, but we do have the perfect conditions for temperate rainforest and for lichens to thrive. So we have special Cornish weather known as mizzle, which is a cross between mist and drizzle, which we have very frequently here, and is one of the reasons that twigs like this are so common where I live, just festooned with lichens, because they really love those really damp, moist and mild conditions. So on this twig here, I'm not expecting you to be able to see a great amount of detail on here, but you can hopefully make out that there are lots of lichens growing, and that there are lots of different sort of forms to them. So we have some very bushy, tufted sort of lichens growing. We have some lovely leafy ones. You won't be able to see the sort of crusts that I've got on here as well. They look a bit like paint. There are lots of different colours. You may be able to see there are greens, greys and yellows on here as well. And lichens are very varied in terms of their forms, their colours, how they look. But they're often unfamiliar to us because in terms of their morphology, they're not familiar in the way that plants are. Even the bryophytes, most of them have leaves and stems and features that we can name, but lichens don't because they're not plants. So it can be very difficult as a beginner to sort of find a way in, you know, how do you describe them? There's lots of new terminology. Where do you start? Really, and actually the place you tend to start is again by looking at growth forms. So there are three main growth forms when we talk about lichens. So I'm going to introduce you to those, and I'm going to show you a little video so it'll be easier for you to see. This time brought to you from Temperate Rainforest in my neighbouring Devon. So I'll just click on this slide and you'll just see a little video introducing you to those three main growth forms of lichens.
Lichens are symbiotic organisms. They're an association between a fungus and usually an alga or another photosynthetic partner. We've got a whole range of different lichens growing here on this twig. So there are three main growth forms of lichens. We've got all three of them on this twig. So we've got the bushy lichens here, which are also known as fruticose lichens. And you can identify those because they're attached just at one point to the twig, and they're very branched, often with very fine spindly branches like this. We also have our Folios Lichens or Leafy Lichens, and these ones are attached at many places, and they have a distinct upper and lower side. And they're usually attached by little rhizines that look like roots, but they're not actually drawing up any water. They're just there to attach them to the surface, and you could easily peel those away if you wanted to. And then we also have the third one, which is crusty or crustose lichens, and there's an example just here. And these ones are completely attached to the thing that they're growing on. You can't peel them off at all. They look as though they've actually been painted on to the twig or rock that they're growing on.
Okay, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit more about those three growth forms and give you some examples to bring them to life a little bit. So I talked first of all about the fruticose or bushy lichens. So you can see these here, and some of these fruticose or bushy lichens, such as those on the left hand of the slide, are quite upright, sort of tufted, short branches. And others have a sort of pendulous growth form where they hang down from the substrate that they're growing on, often the branches and the canopies of trees. And there's a particular species here that I wanted to talk to you about called Osmia Articulator, which is the string of sausages lichen. So with these bushy lichens, there are several genera that you're likely to encounter. One of the larger ones is the Osmias, or the beard lichens, and they have these very fine wispy branches that are actually rounded in cross section. So some of them, other species, are flattened, like in the top left-hand corner, the image that you can see there. They look quite coral-like, but all of the Osmias, all of the beard lichens, their stems and their branches are cylindrical, and they're very, very fine. But if you were to cut through them and take a cross section and then look at the end, it would be rounded. And this particular species, Osmia articulator, the string of sausages lichen, hangs down from the branches like this. And then it's got these, some of these branches are inflated and then constricted at intervals along their length. So they look like a string of butcher's sausages. And they hang down like this, and this actually helps to make them more sort of airborne. So these detach very easily from the main lichen, and then they will blow in the wind, And then often they'll land on nearby branches, perhaps neighbouring trees, and it helps the lichen to spread over a short distance and colonise new areas. And quite often in a very well lit area, these lichens need lots and lots of light, you will see them strung up in the canopy of these open grown trees, sort of looking like streamers. So really quite remarkable to see. And this species is one that we have particularly in southwestern temperate rainforest. It's one of our sort of special species that we have an international responsibility to conserve. It's quite rare elsewhere, including in other parts of the UK, and it is a really strong indicator of clean air. It cannot tolerate much pollution at all, so you tend to find it in really good high quality temperate rainforest sites, and also on isolated trees and places like Dartmoor and Exmoor. So if you're in those areas, it's a nice one to look out for. But elsewhere, you may see other Osmia species. They might not be hanging down like this. They might be more tufted, sitting on tops of the twigs, and they won't have the inflated string of sausages lobes. But you will recognise an Osmia, a beard lichen, because it's got the very fine wispy branches and it's cylindrical in cross section. If you were to cut through one of those branches, it would be rounded. So a good one to look out for. And we're finding that as air pollution, particularly in urban areas, reduces, you're actually starting to find some of the Osmia species even in urban areas. Where I live, the city of Plymouth is not too far away, and in some of the larger parks you can find some of the Osmia species actually growing on the twigs of those trees. Okay, then I'm just going to look again at Folios lichens, which I mentioned second in that video. So these are also known as the Leafy Lichens. And these ones differ from the fruticose lichens because they have a very distinct upper and lower side, and they are attached in multiple places to the substrate that they're growing on, usually by these little root-like structures called rhizines. And these they're very, very diverse. There are many different species, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the species in the left-hand corner here, Palmatrema pilatum. The common name for this lichen is the sea storm lichen. And common names for lichens have just been invented recently, really. There are many that don't have common names at all. They only have the Latin, the scientific names, but the common names have been given to try and help make them more accessible. In some cases, I feel that the common names aren't that descriptive or useful, but this one I love because I think it really conjures up a stormy sea when you look at this lichen. It's a leafy lichen that's got these really curled up edges, and if you look closely, you may be able to see in that image the edges of those lobes look sort of powdery, and it reminds me of frothy waves breaking on a stormy sea. And that powdery margin that this lichen has is actually a very special way of reproducing. It's a form of asexual reproduction. So those little granules that are scattered along the edges of these lobes are called ceridia. And what ceridia are is they're little propagules that contain both the fungus and the alga that makes up the lichen, and they detach and then they can blow. They're quite small, they can blow in the wind, they can land in another suitable spot, and then a clone of the parent lichen will then start to grow in that place. So that's a really clever thing that many lichens can do. The top right hand image is showing another couple of Folios lichens. One of them, the bright yellow lichen, is another one I'm going to talk to you about a bit later on. Its name is Zanthuria Pariatina, and it has lots of common names. I can't remember any of them off the top of my head right now. I think Sunburst Lichen is one of them, yellow wall lichen. So it's got lots of different common names people have given it. But you can see on that photograph that there are these round structures on it, and these are fruiting bodies of the fungus. They're known as apothecia, but we also sometimes call them jam tarts. They look a bit like jam tarts with a crust around and then the filling in the middle. So as well as reproducing asexually, as we saw on the sea storm lichen, lichens can also produce sexually, and the fungal partners produce spores as the lichen. They send out spores, hundreds and thousands of spores into the atmosphere, which then need to meet up again with their correct photosynthetic partner to form the lichen. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The final growth form of lichens that I mentioned are the crusty or crustose lichens. And these again are hugely diverse. I just wanted to point out a couple of interesting features. So on this bottom left image and the top right image, we can see just a mosaic of crust lichens, and they grow like this often on smooth barked trunks of trees like hazel and on rocks and boulders in the temperate rainforest. And you will often find that you can go up to a tree or a rock like this and you'll be hard pushed to find any bare surface. They're just lichens tessellating with one another. And many of these species have a margin, a dark margin around the edge, and it's prothallus, and that marks the edge of one lichen's territory in the beginning of another. So that's an interesting thing to look for on the crustose lichens. And I mentioned fruiting bodies. We saw the jam tart fruiting bodies on the previous slide. The bottom central image here is showing another type of fruiting body that some lichens have. These are known as script lichens. They're a type of crusty lichen. They sort of look like they've been painted on, but then they have these little squiggles that look a bit like writing or hieroglyphs, and those are actually another type of fruiting body that you can find. Okay, so what actually are lichens? Usually I start with this slide, but I wanted to kind of introduce those growth forms and a bit of the diversity first. So I touched in the very beginning of that video on what lichens are, that they are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and then a photosynthetic partner, which is either an alga, usually an alga in 90% of lichen species, or in about 10% of lichen species, it's cyanobacterium. There are some lichens that actually have a fungus, an alga, and a cyanobacterium, such as the right-hand image there, which is showing the tree lungwort lichen, a really rare and special lichen of our temperate rainforest, and that actually has both photosynthetic partners involved. So we have this sort of to be a symbiotic relationship. With the fungal partner being what you really see, which forms the main body of the lichen. It forms the cortex, which is sort of like the surface layer, and then just underneath that surface layer is where you find the photosynthetic partner. So it's near the surface, so it's able to get the sunlight and use that to make food for the partnership. And the fungus actually takes most of that food immediately once it's made. And then the alga or the cyanobacterium in the partnership is thought to benefit from having a more sort of stable environment provided by the fungus. Beneath the algal layer or the cyanobacterium, you've got a larger, a thicker layer of fungal hyphae with lots of gaps that can hold lots of moisture. So that can help prevent the alga or the cyanobacterium from drying out, whereas living on its own, it could be more vulnerable to desiccation, more vulnerable to herbivory. There are scientists who feel that it's not really a true symbiosis because the fungal partner is the one that really is dependent on the photosynthetic partner. The fungi that are involved in lichens cannot survive on their own. They completely depend on the algae or the cyanobacterium. So once those fungal spores have gone off into the atmosphere, they need to meet up with a photosynthetic partner pretty quickly in order to survive. Whereas the algal partner and the cyanobacterium can be free living and they can survive on their own. So is it a true symbiosis, or is it more of a case of the fungus sort of enslaving the photosynthetic partner? It's still something that's quite debated, really. There are also other organisms involved in lichens that we're starting to understand a little bit more about. There are yeasts found, and there are other bacteria involved, and the roles of those organisms are still being explored. But the important thing, I think, is that the fungal partner are responsible for most of the diversity in lichens. So about 1/5 of the entire fungi kingdom live as lichens, and that is their mode of nutrition, and they cannot live any other way. Whereas there are about 100 known species of photosynthetic partner. So most of the diversity is because of the diversity of the fungal partners involved. So I've got another short video clip here, just talking a little bit more about how lichens live and how they survive.
So lichens don't actually possess roots. They draw their water, their nutrients from the atmosphere around them. And this enables them to grow in all sorts of environments and different places. So they're not restricted to growing somewhere where there's soil. They will grow on the trunks of trees, they will grow high up in the tree canopy on twigs, they grow on rocks, they grow on man-made surfaces. So the fact that they don't have roots enables them to survive in quite extreme environments where other things can't grow. Another adaptation that lichens have, which enables them to survive in extreme places, is chemical compounds. And the chemical compounds in lichens give rise to their vibrant colours. We see lichens that in our temperate rainforests are often greys and greens, but we also see lichens with yellows, pinks, oranges, reds, so all different colours, and this comes from these chemical compounds, and they play a vital role in helping lichens to survive. Up to 20% of the dry weight of a lichen is made up of the chemical compounds, and these compounds have different roles. So one of those is to protect the lichen and particularly the algae within from damage from UV, as lichens often grow in exposed places. The chemical compounds also have a role in deterring herbivores, and they even have been found to have an allelopathic role, which enables the lichens to compete with other plants and other lichens. So they actually emit chemical signals that prevent the other lichens and plants from growing too close or growing over them. So here on this branch we can see actually a mosaic of different crustose lichens, and you can see these little boundaries. Some of these have this thaline margin or this prothallus, which shows the edge of that lichen's territory. So on a very, very slow timescale, lichens are actually waging their own wars with other lichens and plants growing next to them and competing for space and that vital light that they need so much.
Okay, so I talked a little bit in that video about chemical compounds in lichens, which is something I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of. There are many different chemical compounds found within lichens. So far, about a third of all lichens have actually been investigated for their chemical compounds. And people have identified about 350 different chemical compounds involved in lichens, but there are probably many more than that, because there is still around 2/3 of the known species that haven't been investigated, and many more species that haven't been described as well. I mentioned UV protection is one of the roles that these chemical compounds have within lichens. So I wanted to give the example here of, here we are, yellow wall lichen, Zanthuria Pariatina, which is a really common species. So this is one that is actually pretty tolerant of pollution. So you will find this growing in all sorts of places, wherever you are in the UK. This is one you should be able to find. Usually growing on twigs and sometimes trunks, but occasionally also on rocks. And this lichen, the name Pariatina, comes from the fact that it's got the chemical compound parietin within it. And this compound increases when the lichen is exposed to sunlight. And it actually has the role of absorbing UVB radiation, which is damaging to the lichen. So when you find this lichen growing in quite deep shade, it doesn't have much of that compound in it, and it's that compound that gives it the really bright yellow colour. When you see this lichen growing in the shade, as in the top image here, it tends to be more of a greeny yellow colour, and sometimes more of sort of washed out. But when you find it growing in highlight environments, it's a very bright yellow, because that compound is increased in order to prevent the UV from damaging the lichen, and particularly the photosynthetic partner within. Interestingly as well, many lichens change colour when they get damp and wet. So sometimes when you see this lichen very wet, it will look more of a green colour, and that's because the fungal cortex becomes quite translucent when it's wet. So you see more of the photosynthetic partner, the colour of the alga beneath, which is more of a green colour. So that's an example. There are a number of other compounds as well that are involved in UV protection in different species of lichen. Chemical compounds, as I mentioned in the video, also have a role in protecting lichens from herbivores, which is a real issue actually, because some of the lichens that we work on, some of the quite rare temperate rainforest lichens, like the tree lungwort that I mentioned earlier, can be really badly damaged by slugs and snails eating them. So having a chemical defense against those is really useful. One lichen that does have that is Fusarium amara, the bitter wart lichen. You see some photographs of it here. So this is a crusty or crustose lichen. It's found in the temperate rainforest, and it looks like sort of white paint on the tree with lots of these circular powdery bits, which are sporidia, like I mentioned earlier. So they're involved in asexual reproduction. And if you were to wipe your finger across these sporidia, you'd get some of the powder on your fingertip. And actually, this is the only lichen that where taste is used to confirm its identification. So there's a similar species called Pipinnate Fern, which looks very similar but doesn't have a bitter taste. So lichenologists will do a couple of tiny granules of this lichen on their finger and taste it. And it's bitter because it contains oxalic acid, which is also found in many plants, including the oxalis, the wood sorrel genus. If you've ever tasted the leaves of wood sorrel, it has quite a pleasant peppery taste. This isn't a very pleasant taste, it's a really, really bitter one. So when you've done this one time, you learn that you only need really one little granule on your finger in order to do the taste test. You don't want to use a lot of it. And it contains the oxalic acid, and that is thought to help defend the lichen against herbivores eating it, so it protects it from herbivory. So really, really useful chemical defense. And again, there are other chemical compounds and other lichens that perform similar functions. Okay. So before I finish up on the lichens, I just wanted to give you an overview of why lichens are so important. So we've looked at what they are, some tips to identify them and work out their growth forms. And we talked a little bit about how they live, but why do they matter? Why are we interested in conserving them? Because our project that we've been working on in the southwest of England, and Plantlife has other projects in Scotland and Wales, have a big focus around conserving these temperate rainforests and conserving their important lichens and bryophytes. So why is it that lichens are so important? So they have an important ecological role as colonizers. Like the bryophytes, they can grow in areas where other plants can't grow because they don't have roots, they don't need to put roots down into soil to get water, they obtain everything from the atmosphere, so they can grow on bare rock, they can grow on man-made surfaces, and they can then change their environment. They can start over time as they decompose to build up a soil layer and allow other plants to colonize. They're a really important habitat and food source as well. So particularly in places where they are very abundant, like the temperate rainforest, you look up into the canopy, they're a significant component of that ecosystem. They provide places for other organisms to live. They provide shelter within their structures, particularly for many invertebrates. They act as a food source for many invertebrates. And often you'll see birds actually foraging within lichens because that is one of the best habitats for small invertebrates to live within the temperate rainforest, but also in other environments that are quite extreme, like the Arctic and subarctic. Lichens are often one of the key food sources for organisms there. They play an important role in the nutrient cycle as well. So 10% of lichens contain cyanobacteria. They actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So in environments where there isn't much nitrogen available to other organisms, the lichens are able to fix it from the atmosphere and then make it available for other life to thrive. Biomedical potential, those chemical compounds that are in lichens, those 350 compounds that we've found so far, have all sorts of potential uses, and a lot of this is only just starting to be properly explored, but we have found antiviral properties, anti-cancer properties, antibiotic properties within those compounds. So there's a lot of potential there, particularly as that's only just really starting to be properly researched. In terms of UK conservation, why this is so important here, we have about 10% of the global species within Britain. So there are 20,000 species so far described worldwide. We have 2,000 in the UK. And 75% of those that we have an international responsibility to protect are found within our temperate rainforest. So it's a really critical habitat for lichens and also for the bryophytes and the ferns. And that's the reason we're doing so much work on these. And hopefully one of the key things actually is getting the message out there, because many people aren't aware of lichens, of what they really are. But one of the things I think is so wonderful about lichens and bryophytes in particular is that they are there all year round, whether you live in temperate rainforest or whether you're elsewhere in the UK, whether you're rural or urban. You can see them all over the place. You can see them, you know, growing in paving cracks and growing on pavements and picnic benches in parks. And they're there all year round. So even in the depths of winter, when, you know, very little is flowering, there are no leaves on the trees, there are no insects around, you can still see lichens, you can still see mosses. So just being aware of them, I think, adds a lot of interest to those who are interested in nature. So hopefully we've given you a bit of a flavour of those three fascinating groups, and you'll be able to go away and find out more if you want to. But before we move to Q&A, and I know there are lots of questions that have been pinging up in the chat and in the Q&A, we have lots of resources and lots that we would recommend to you. So this will be shared on our YouTube so you can have another look. We've just given you a very brief introduction, but we do at Plantlife have guides to ferns, mosses and liverworts and lichens of temperate rainforest, which you can get, you can download for free from our website. And we also have a number of other guides from other organisations which we really recommend to people, as well as the websites of the main societies, the British Ecological Society, British Biological Society and British Lichen Society. They have a huge amount of useful information on their websites. And we also, as Kate has mentioned, are going to be having these interactive learning modules on our website that will take you through the material that we've covered today and much more information, and you'll be able to actually complete little tasks on there, go out and find things and look for things and learn more if you'd like to. So I think we're going to move now to a Q&A and try and answer any of the questions that we haven't already answered by typing to you.
So Alison, I'm going to stop sharing and then we can all see the slides. There we go. And yes, we've had lots of questions coming in through the Q&A. So I'm going to go through them and then direct them at myself or Alison. Right from the beginning, the first one we had is from Sarah Thomas, thank you for joining us. Do mosses help create soils? Do you want to start with that one, Alison?
Yeah, I can do. So, I mean, in the same way that lichens, I mean, they, over time, they will die and decompose and start to build up a humus layer of soil, which will then allow seeds from other plants to germinate. So in that sense, yes, they do over time start to build up a sort of humus layer of soil or of decaying organic matter.
The next one we have is in regards to lichens and pollution tolerance or intolerance, is it the fungus of the algae, or sorry, is it the fungus or the algae which is susceptible to pollution, or is it the whole association?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I didn't answer that in the chat form because it's a complicated answer, I think. So pollution, those that are intolerant, pollution will basically stop the lichen metabolizing and stop it being able to grow. So I think it's the whole association that's affected. I mean, the alga, some of the algal partners and cyanobacteria partners involved on their own are more tolerant. So I'm not exactly sure how it works, but I think it affects the way the association works and metabolizes. And I think really it's probably the fungal partner that's affected by that. But that will then prevent the lichen from being able to survive in those conditions. Sorry, that's not a perfect answer, because I'm not completely sure. And I did try and have a little look to get a more definitive answer. I couldn't find any information on it. So yeah, I think it's the fungal partner, and because the fungal partner cannot survive without the alga, then the whole association sort of breaks down.
The next one is again from Sarah. What nutrients do lichens need to survive, if any?
Yeah, so the same nutrients as other organisms and other plants, really. So they need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and they're absorbing their nutrients from the atmosphere. And some of them, if they have a cyanobacteria partner, are also fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere as well.
The next one is, are cladonias a distinct form of lichen?
Yeah, so that's another good question. And yes, we talked about 3 main growth forms to sort of simplify things. There are some lichens that kind of fall into a different growth form. So cladonia is a genus of lichen. There are actually some cladonia lichens that are fruticodes, sort of bushy lichens. But many of them fall into another growth form, which is called squamulos. And squamules are like tiny leafy lobes that look almost powder-like. They're so small. And the cladonias, they start off squamulos, and then they grow these little sort of stalks with cups, often with cups on the tip, that have the fruiting bodies. So yeah, the cladonias, many of them do fall more into that squamulos growth form, but we didn't go into that because we're trying to keep it quite simple. And the 3 main growth forms are those ones we talked about, but there are some exceptions.
Oh, I like this one. How do white lichens photosynthesize?
So lichens that are white or grey or colours besides green still have a photosynthetic partner, be it an alga or cyanobacteria, but you can't see the colour of that because the lichen contains another compound, which is then overriding that, if you like. It's the colour that you see because that compound is in the cortex, the surface layer of the fungus. So it's like the yellow lichen I showed as well. It does have green alga underneath, but you don't generally see that because the yellow compound is in the surface layer, the cortex, and that's what you see.
The next one, are some species of lichens threatened by pollution?
Yeah, definitely. So many lichens declined in the last century, particularly due to acid rain and air pollution. So one of the communities of lichens we do a lot of work on is the Liberian community, and the flagship species is the pre-lungwort, the Liberia pulmonaria, and that was devastated by air pollution. Its range contracted massively, and it still sort of clings on in the far west of Britain in some temperate rainforest locations. Disappeared from much of Europe as well. So many lichens declined due to pollution. Some of them now starting to recover a little bit as air quality improves. But some of them, they can be very slow to recolonize areas that they've been lost from.
We've had a few questions about where the videos are. So Plantlife has a YouTube page. So if you go onto YouTube and search for Plantlife, it has its own YouTube page that will have the webinars on. And then our project has our own YouTube page. So I'll ask Alison another question and then put the link to our one on there, because there are videos on there and there's playlists as well. Because one of the questions is about children, and we have a playlist that has videos for children as well. So if I ask Alison, are there any liverworts that resemble Folios Lichens and vice versa?
It depends. I suppose it depends who you ask. To me, no, because I'm very familiar with the differences and what they look like, but certainly if you're starting to look at them, then yes. The Folios Liverworts don't have leaves and stems. They are a creeping phallus in the same way that a lichen is. So I suppose the sort of morphology looks quite similar. The liverworts are generally dark green in colour, whereas the lichens, because of the fungal partner and the fungal cortex on top, don't tend to be that really deep bright green. So yeah, I think it depends on how familiar you are with looking at them and looking at the differences between them. They do look quite different, but I suppose you need to have seen them and seen different Folios lichens and seen different Folios liverworts to be clear on those differences. But generally the Folios liverworts are really dark green colour. They may well grow in the same places on the trunks of trees. The lichens are likely to be less deep green. And you might see, often on the Folios lichens, you're going to see rhizines underneath, hanging down, that look a bit like roots. And the liverworts have something called rhizoids, but then they don't tend to be as obvious or noticeable. Yeah.
This question from Anthony, so we just might need a bit more detail into it. So he's asked, how do you define a lichen species when it's made up of a fungal species and an algal species?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And we do tend to talk about lichens as species, even though they are composite organisms, so they're made up of multiple species. And the Latin name is usually based on the fungal partner and often related to the chemical compounds within, but based in some part on the fungal partner. So that tends to kind of be, in terms of the taxonomy, we focus on the fungal partner because they're responsible for most of the diversity. But for simplicity's sake, we tend to refer to lichens as species, different species of lichen, even though technically speaking, you're looking at a composite organism.
The next one we have is, can we propagate, I'm guessing this is lichens, can we propagate them, and if so, and maybe we can mention something about translocations as well.
Yeah, you can in some ways. The lichens are producing propagules in terms of their seridia that I talked about. And some of them also produce another structure which is involved in asexual reproduction called ascidia. And if those are rubbed off onto another surface which is suitable for them to grow on, then they can potentially grow again there. Some lichens, particularly the rarer species, have very specific requirements. So if the conditions aren't quite right, then it might not be successful. Particularly some of these rarer species that we work on. We have done some translocations as well. So ash dieback is a huge problem for a lot of rare lichens, and particularly those in the Liberian community that tend to prefer to grow on ash and other trees with base-rich bark. So where we've had ash trees dying or needing to be felled with lots of interesting lichens on, we have done some translocations where you actually carefully remove that lichen from its surface and then attach it to another tree that seems to be growing in the right conditions. And you can just place mesh over it and then pin that mesh onto the tree, and the lichen will, over time, providing the conditions are right, it doesn't get grazed by slugs and snails, it can reattach onto that surface. So translocation is often what's used when you're looking to move lichens from one place to another, but it is something that requires expertise and needs a lot of careful thought in terms of where should that lichen be growing. It's not a very natural thing to do, so we tend to only do it in exceptional circumstances.
And then the last question I can see at the moment, unless anyone has anything else they want to add, I've never had this one before. Is it possible to age a lichen?
Yeah, it is. So lichens, and I saw a question in the chat as well actually about how fast lichens grow, so it's related. So that it varies hugely from lichen to lichen, that the rate of growth and therefore aging them will be quite species dependent. Generally, the fruticose, the bushy lichens, grow quite quickly and are quite short-lived. So some of them only live for maybe a decade or so. and they can colonize, you know, in a year, because you often see them growing on the new growth of trees, on new twigs. And the leafy lichens as well tend to be, some of the species are again quite fast growing. The crustose lichens are the ones I've generally heard about people aging. Some of those are very slow growing, and you find on gravestones sometimes, or other monuments, stone monuments, people sometimes try to use the lichens to actually date the monument, because you can, with some species, measure them and then work out their growth rate and work out how old they are. So yes, it is possible to do that, but it's not sort of, you know, one rule for all lichens. They do grow at very different rates.
And then I've got one final question I've just found in the chat, and this is related to ferns. Is there a particular time of year that ferns produce spores?
Oh yes, so generally in the UK, ferns are producing their spores in the summer, when the conditions are best for spore dispersal, which is when the humidity is low. So that's when the spores are going to travel much further, which is generally what the fern wants to do in terms of dispersing far and wide. So it tends to be in summer. The spore cases will start to develop late spring, early summer, and will then often persist for quite a while after the spores have dispersed. So they can be used as an identification feature, often well into the winter.
Great. Well, I think we're going to end it here. If you do have any more questions for us, both our emails are on the Plantlife website, so please do get in contact. We also do have our own Facebook page, which is Building Resilience as well, so you can find us that way as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. We've had some really lovely comments in the chat, and that's been great that everyone's really enjoyed it. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking when you do the webinar, so I'm really happy everybody's enjoyed it today. And yes, please do check out the Plantlife website to see if there are any other workshops or webinars you might be interested in. And then on the Plantlife YouTube page, you can see them all going up once they've happened. So if you've missed any, you can catch up on those as well. But yeah, thank you very much from me and Alison.